Hello, my name is Andreas Joswig. I want to talk about grammar for translation consultants and about a new idea for a training program that addresses quality in Bible translation. I want to begin with the role of consultants in quality assurance when it comes to Bible translation. A translation consultant will have a role in checking that a translated text is exegetically correct and adequate. And there's also a check for lexical equivalence, that things are really expressed in the best possible way lexically. Then there's the open question whether there is a need for a consultant to check on the appropriate use of the target language grammar. Well, common wisdom nowadays says that it's unnecessary to go that way. Mother tongue translators know their grammar and they don't make mistakes, and for that reason, grammatical checking is not an issue. With that in mind, nowadays translation consultants are also not trained to check translation on grammar issues. But in this presentation, I want to challenge that common wisdom and also the practice. To do that, first have a look at mother tongue translators and grammar. There is certainly a correct idea that a translator will not create ungrammatical sentences while translating into the mother tongue. You can assume that agreement patterns will always be correct. You can also assume that word order will always follow the basic syntactic requirements of the language. So with all this in mind, just assume that all the sentences that are translated follow a grammatical pattern. But a grammatical sentence as such may still be a bad choice for grammatical reasons, and that's the big point of this presentation. Each grammatical structure is part of a network of choices and possibilities. If you pick one grammatical structure, you may actually lay aside another one, and all of these have semantic implications. The semantic underpinnings of grammatical structures are often not consciously known by untrained mother tongue speakers. And without this knowledge, the chosen structure, although grammatical, may convey the wrong meaning. Untrained translators tend to use grammatical structures that are close to the source language structure. So if they see something which they have in their language, they will tend to also translate into a structure that looks similar. So what is translation? What happens at translation? There is the well-known idea by Eugene Nida that you start out with a source language text. It needs to be analyzed, broken down to its meaning components, and these meaning components are then transferred into the target language, where they are then restructured into the surface form that will be the final translation. So when it comes to the source language text, there are a lot of helps available nowadays. We have translation aids like a Greek dictionary, we have a Greek grammar, we have commentaries, and all of these things, they focus on doing the left part of the translation process, the analysis part. When it comes to the right side of restructuring the meaning components into the receptor language, we just assume that the mother tongue translator knows the language and all is well. With this in mind, the whole translation methodology is focused more on the left side and on the transfer of the meaning parts, but there is not much intentionality getting into the restructuring and the surface language structure there. So how this looks nowadays in the year 2023 will be illustrated by a very short sentence from John 1, verse 14. In the Greek, it's sounding a bit like this with my bad German Greek pronunciation. Kai etia sameta ten doxan autou. So what do we have here? We have a coordinating conjunction kai. We have a verb, etia sameta, which is the first person plural past perfective form of theaomai, which means see or look at. Then we have ten, which is an article. It's definite, it's feminine, it's singular, and it's accusative. And then we have doxan, which is the singular accusative form of doxa, And that could have all kinds of meanings like expectation or opinion or illusion or glory or honor. And finally, you have a possessive pronoun, which is of the form genitive singular masculine. So when we expect somebody to translate this into their mother tongue, we probably would tell them something to go through the following steps. The first one would be to discuss for 2 hours which meaning of doxa is intended in this particular context. In fact, a commentary will tell you that. The next step is to make sure that you find the best word for it in the target language. And then you just put everything back together in the target language without making any mistakes. It's so easy to translate. Well, there are some small problems with that. If we look at the same text and consider some particular target languages, here are some things you might run into. Majang is an Ethiopian Nilo-Saharan language. And in the Majang language, there is a clause coordinating conjunction ne that can be used just as kai in Greek. So wherever you have a kai in Greek starting a sentence, you could use that conjunction ne with a similar good effect. In another Ethiopian language, Amharic, there is no such conjunction between clauses. So if I use the Amharic inna and, this would be very awkward. So it really depends on the grammar of the target language, whether I use a particular conjunction or not. In other Nilo-Saharan languages, there is a distinction between first person plural exclusive and inclusive. Exclusive means that the addressed people are not included in the we, and inclusive means that the addressed people are included in the we. So if you have a distinction like that in the target language, you need to make sure that you have the correct choice in each translated verse. You need to decide whether the addressee is included or not. In most African languages, you don't use articles like we have in Greek or English or German, but you have very diverse ways of showing definite reference or topicality. Some languages with definite articles still sound very awkward when the article is used in this context. And in some languages, I cannot use a possessive pronoun like in Greek. In other languages, I must use such a pronoun. And in some languages, I have a choice between pronouns and possessive marking on the noun, as we have in English. So here are some results of these problems looking at individual languages. In English, this is how we would translate the same verse that we've seen in Greek. We saw his glory. So what do we have here? We do not have a clause conjunction in the beginning. The kai is not translated. We have a subject pronoun, we, which we don't have in the Greek text. We have no article in English, so the ten is not translated directly. And we have a possessive pronoun just as we have in English. While German is very similar, wir sahen seine Herrlichkeit. We still have a subject pronoun, we have no clause conjunction, no article, and a possessive pronoun, all very much like we have in English. But this is not the standard how most languages would do it. So Amharic looks very different. We have Kibrun Ayen, and there's no subject pronoun in this sentence. There's no article whatsoever. There's no clause conjunction, and there's also no possessive pronoun because the possessive is marked on the noun. So this is a very different structure. And here's another fine example from Suri. I don't dare to read that, but in this particular translation, there is a clause conjunction, like I talked about Majang before, which works in the same way as kai in Greek. The verb form has an inclusive marking for the first person plural, which is probably an error, but that certainly was not because of lack of discussion. So all these translations were necessary because the grammatical structures of the target languages were forcing these kind of decisions. If you know about these things, you actually need to make these decisions for these languages. If you just follow the Greek structure, all the translations, there would be either awkward, or there would be unreadable, or there might even be theologically wrong. And there are quite a lot of examples where this might be the result, that in the end, because the grammar wasn't chosen correctly, that you have a theologically questionable result. Yeah, the big point that decides how much grammar is important are the choices that the grammar provides in the language. In Bible translation, the source languages, they make use of a limited set of grammatical features which need to be translated into languages that often provide dramatically more possibilities than we find in Greek. Translators can only translate well when they have a good awareness of their choices in their grammar. These choices, unfortunately, they are not often conscious to the untrained translators. We can even consider that for ourselves. If somebody asks us, when do you use this particular form in your language, you cannot easily talk about that. In fact, all of these choices that you have in grammar, they require careful study to understand the semantic causes. They are not trivial, they are not self-evident, they need to be studied very carefully. And translators, they can only know about these things if they are made aware of them and if things have been studied before. So here are some areas of increased choice in target language grammars, things that you need to study to know about them so that you can tell your translators what they need to know for good translation. So for example, there's participant reference grammar, everything that makes reference to participants in the text. Those could be pronouns, or they could just be agreement on the verb. A language might have switch reference systems, which is a very different system. You need to know about these to translate correctly. Pronoun systems as such have very different categories between languages. You may have different numbers of genders. You may have a dual form on top of a singular and a plural. You may have honor systems in your pronoun system. You may have what we've seen before, inclusive versus exclusive first-person plural forms. All these things you need to know in order to make the correct choices in all cases. Deixis, that is what languages do to refer to items in space or time. For example, demonstratives. They may use, in many languages, other reference points. For example, where we use just a difference between far and near. Other languages may have a reference point that includes speakers and hearers and everybody else. You may have entirely different systems of spatial orientation. So these things, they need to be studied to use correctly in translation. You may have constituent order changes or variability, and they often have to do with things like topic or focus. And again, you can only apply them correctly if you know how they work. That requires study. There is a very different use of conjunctions between languages, as we've seen in Greek and Nilo-Saharan languages. You may have a fairly happy use of conjunctions between clauses where other languages don't do that at all. Tenses and aspects are well known for having very different features between languages and different categories, and a totally different carving up of time, space. So they need to be studied very carefully. Even beyond that, verbal categories such as modalities need to be studied, because there's a lot of grammatical morphology in many languages, including evidentiality or mirrativity, counter-expectational marking. Those might force the translator to make choices which are not there in the Greek language, where you really have to tell the reader how do you know, or how the speaker actually knows about what he's talking about. These kind of things require choices for the translator that you can only make properly if you know how the grammar works. There's the grammar of relative clauses, where you have very different ways how they work between languages. And if you there pick the wrong form in relative clauses, you may get very wrong idea of what's happening. And that may get you into wrong theology if you don't know what you're doing. And there are many, many more grammatical forms and systems that if you don't know about them in the target language, you run into deep trouble when you're translating. So that leads me to the conclusion that target language grammar is underrated in the Bible translation movement nowadays. The situation is now the translators are minimally trained about their grammar. They get good training about exegesis, about Greek possibly, about the source language structures and about finding the right words. But when it comes to the grammar, about the structures of their own languages, they get very little training. And also nowadays, translation projects normally have no linguistic input whatsoever. There is not much going on to train translators in linguistics. Also, when it comes to consultant training, the target language grammar currently plays no role in most consultant training systems that we have. So grammar right now is not being trained to future Bible translation consultants. And that is reflected in how consultant sessions go nowadays. They usually do not pay any attention to target language structures. Still, we believe that paying attention to target language structures has a substantial impact on the quality of the resulting Bible translation. This is important, and if it's not being paid attention to, we really create problems for the quality of the Bible translation. So, to address this, we've come to the idea that it is important to focus on Bible translation consultants. Consultants are usually linguistically literate. They've had some linguistic training. They can read and understand grammar descriptions. And for that reason, they are currently more promising agents of getting grammar back into Bible translation than regular mother tongue translators are, because they do not have this kind of training nowadays. With this in mind, earlier this year in spring, we tried out a workshop in Nairobi to acquaint Bible translation consultant training with grammatical topics that play a role in translation quality. So there were 11 participants from 6 organizations all over Africa, from ANTBA, BTL, Capital, Gilbert, SAL, and the Bible Society. And they came together for 4 weeks in Nairobi, and there were daily grammar lessons, tutorials, and most of the time, the work on the structures of one particular language that these individual participants were working with or expected to work with in the future. And all this was facilitated by 4 experienced grammar consultants. So that was a pretty steep and long program that really exposed the participants to a lot of grammar that was particularly geared towards what is important in Bible translation. So here are a few pictures. It was a very intense workshop, but it also created a good community. And I really want to state that the results of these workshops have been very encouraging to those who were there. Each participant who was there created a grammar summary sheet that listed features of a particular language that needs attention in translation consulting sessions. So this was a tangible result of this workshop, and it is expected that such a sheet also needs to be around for any consultant session that they work on in the future with any language they work on. Also, going through the lessons, the participants became more and more convinced that not enough attention is given to grammar in the translation process. So that is something they quickly learned, that seeing all these grammatical features, they really play a role and they need to be considered, and they haven't so far. So with this idea, they went back with plans to talk to their supervisors and their organizations that a lot more must be done to include grammar into the quality assurance for Bible translation. And that also includes training for consultants and changes to the consultant process. Here are some quotes by participants that they said after the workshop. One said, "If we don't handle the grammatical issues, we will not have good results in translation." So that is a stark realization. And another one said afterwards, "Today people are motivated by speed because they say Jesus is coming and they want to hasten this by translating quickly. We have now seen that this reduces quality. More grammar is needed." So with this in mind, we need to ask ourselves, what's next? The next workshop of this kind is planned for Francophone Africa in the French language in the coming spring. So we hope that this is coming ahead and will have a similar impact on the participants from that part of Africa. But this kind of program wouldn't have to be done just on the regional level. It could also be applied on the entity level with smaller groups and maybe a more closer defined range of languages. So it could be more focused. Our hope is that the growing understanding of the Translation Consultant Corps about the need for grammar to achieve better translation quality will also have an impact on other stakeholders, such as partners and donors, who may be the ones who right now have a bigger interest in getting things done faster and with less grammar. Eventually, we think that the Bible translation movement needs a strategy on how this crucial area can be incorporated into the planning, into the training and funding of the Bible translation effort and workforce. And that gets me to the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your good questions. Thank you very much.